Hello everyone! Today, I thought it'd be interesting to observe and analyze the difference between old and new egos and understand how we went from this to that. So we're gonna check the difference between those, from the formulation to their use, and we'll discuss ideas a bit by the end. But first, what is an ego? If you don't know, you might not have played this game, and I'm not gonna explain what a Limbus company is. There's probably plenty of videos for it. But an ego is basically a special attack you can use by paying sin resources from a gauge right there, and some sanity from the sphere right there. It has two versions, the Awakening, being the regular version, and the Corrosion, another version that tends to be stronger, more costly, and often might target your allies, which can randomly happen if the Corrosion chance is too high, which is based on sanity. Once used, it will change the resistances of your character, as well as activate its passive for the rest of the fight, even if you use another. Well, most of you probably knew most of this. Now, can you tell the difference between those two egos? Yeah, they don't have the same sin cost. Yeah, they don't have the same rank, but yeah, they're not the same sin, and not the same keywords and anxiety cost, but that's not my point. Hold on, let me find a better example. Yeah, let's go with this. Yes, they don't have the same sin cost and all, but the differences I want to point out mostly are on 2 points. The coin number and power, and the features. Let's start with the first. The main difference between older and newer egos, in my opinion, is the number of coins. At the start of the game, all egos had only 1 coin, until one day, the Fire Nation attacked. All egos from season 1, 2 and 3 were only 1 coin, and it was kinda the assumed rule that they were big one-shot attack. But then the first ego to break this tendency was Ishmael's Wingbit, on the third Doppler Snart in May 2024, during Season 4. Yeah, pretty fitting ego for this. And yes, it was at the start of Season 4. After that, during the season, it became a mix of egos having only 1 coin, and those starting to have 2 or more. But then, starting Season 5, the last season at this time, every single ego has had more than 1 coin, save for Otis Magic Bullet, becoming the exception rather than the norm. But the question is, what does it change? Well, just before answering this, I also want to point out the other thing that changed with time, aka the size of the text. And by that I mean the number of effects added to them. Here is the average text of an ego's Awakening at the start. Here's what you can expect from an average one of the same rank now. Yeah, that increased. Feature creep, which is the global increase of effects, text and the likes, is something that happens in most games, to increase the complexity as the player advances and give them more tools once they've learned how to play. In gachas especially, it happens alongside power creep, often to a lesser extent. And Project Moon is very familiar with it if you check out Ruina. So yeah, Ego's effects have been increasing as well, but funnily enough, that doesn't mean they are stronger, just more complicated. So now let's go back to our question. What does it matter? Well, the one big point I wanted to make, and what changed a lot, is when and why you use egos now. One of the main reasons to use egos at the start was to clash. When a big skill rolling for over 20 was coming your way, unless you had one of the biggest skill trees in the game ready with all conditionals, you would use an ego to make sure it didn't wreck your ass. Now, well, it's still the case. But with the multiple coins egos have now, to balance the damage, they are rolling lower in comparison, and because of the need to roll multiple times, it decreases the variance, so the chances to roll tails and decreasing the expected value. So I'll just ask you, which ego do you usually use to clash in those cases? I'm pretty sure most of you would rather use a 1 coin ego to secure it. And not only because of the max roll, but also because most of them tend to have a higher base power, able to win clashes even when rolling tails. For example, Persuadances are very good for this due to their base roll of 26 up to 34. Now we have Airs rolling for 18, and we were criticizing Lifetime Stew for having 18 max. A lot of them also tend to have coin power conditionals as well, breaking their max roll. But that doesn't mean they are useless or inferior. Egos weren't used only for clashing. Another use was for the effects, mostly for healing, keywords, or setup. Healing egos were very few at the start, and while their number increased, their effects were kinda mitigated, and therefore always overshadowed by the sack. But the additions just gave more options and alternatives. Setup egos are still pretty few and far between. What I mean by them is mostly those inflicting debuffs or buffs for damage, like Faust's X-Nail being the most known one at the start, with rip spaces and quick suppressions, and let's include for defense, with on the opposite side Chains of Other being one of the best boss negation in the game. While we do have a few of those here and there, it's mostly a few effects added to give a bit of value, but that most won't necessarily base their strategy around, and that often requires conditions like resonance. The latest example might be Rodion's Indinkant's Trial, which can be a setup for wrath damage, though the application can be very awkward. The egos for keywords are those helping the archetypes, if not creating them, like Onglu's Cavernous Wailing, Otis' Magic Bullet, Rodion's Sanguine Desire, Otis' Ebony Stem, etc. Those are created with time, so it's not like the changes had any impact, if not just creating more archetypes or giving good supports. Overall effects have been increased, though there was a certain shift from damage setups to archetype setups, leaving the damage to the keywords themselves and everything around it. Effects in general have been more complex, but the uses here are just depending on the ego, though stuff like healing did decrease. Some strategies can also be born from them, being core from archetypes, like sacrifices with Yi-Sang's Fell Bullet or Ryoshu's Thoracalgia. However, the setup damage didn't really disappear. Another use was shown into spotlight more and more with time, which is the egos doing damage themselves. At first, egos were used for damage mostly for AoEs, like mass attacks. But due to the lack of damage multipliers, they were not really used too much outside a few cases, like 7 attack weight to get a quick clear, or very specific weakness cases. But now, with multiple coins, while you lose on clash power, you gain a lot more damage in exchange, and that's not even including damage multipliers that have been added a lot more with time. A good comparison would be this. Ishmael's Blind Obsession was a convenient ego to use. You made a pretty big splash of 35 to all enemies most of the time, with its SP cost mostly refunding itself. It was good and often used. Still is, to be fair. But now we've got stuff like this. Dawn's Journey Mirkala. How much damage can you get out of this? A ton. Hundreds of damage for each target in the proper conditions. It is not even close. And while we can scream power creep out of our lungs, I think it is mostly egos being repurposed from utility to damage for both AoE or single target, like with both Mirkalas. Vav's SP cost being diluted over a few turns helping with that as well. Not all, but for some like this. The latest case, Onglu's Tears of the Tarnished Blood, is following on this case. While being way less conventional, the purpose is still to obliterate the enemies, when others beforehand were mostly to help that goal. To conclude this part, the one case I want to highlight here in this vein would be lassos. My first reaction when checking out the egos was pretty much, those look like skill trees. And I think that's a philosophy for quite a few ones. A lot of egos wearing key end up looking a lot like skill trees, mostly the Tet, as above the cost becomes quite high and we don't get much science. And that's probably the best example of the shift in design for egos after Season 4, which started quite clearly with Wingbit. As the last part before concluding, I'm gonna quickly talk about IDs. IDs also had a shift in design, though in this case, it is also influenced by power creep. And I'm not the one saying it, it's the director. But that makes the shift in design here more unavoidable. Also, the change was not really as big. The big differences between this ID and this ID are the values and the features. Values have increased, both in damage and clashing, as 11 rolling skill 1s don't really happen anymore. In fact, values have been standardized, as most skill 1s now, if not all, are 2 coins rolling for 15 with conditionals, and skill 2s are 2 coins rolling for 20, or 3 coins for 22, with damage multiplier compensating the difference, and some coin reuse for fancy sometimes. Most of the individuality comes from skill 3, though they can also look similar. As for features, well, it was bound to happen, so everyone gets their statuses and all. So well, the only real shift in design here is a standardization of IDs to avoid Ring Sang from happening, which still happened. Well. So in conclusion, Eagle's design are pretty different from before. While still being used for their effects, their focus have been shifted from clashing to damage. That means that older egos will probably always be relevant for avoiding one-shots, while damage ones will mostly power creep themselves and might just be options between each other, and mostly linked to their archetypes, as a lot of their power tend to be dependent on keywords conditionals. They tend to have more features, often leading to a higher scene cost nowadays for each rank, though passives are still very different, some better, some worse, but that didn't change from the start. However, I doubt we see many one-coin Zegos going forward, making the older ones relevant for years to come, and we'll keep having damage dealers with multiple coins, archetype-defining ones, or just probably underwhelming ones, some replacing others or finding their own niche. Until we got Alephs at least. I have no idea where they'll go. 20 scenes cost, 90 SP, effect, delete an enemy, restore HP to full. Censored. Yeah, that looks alright. And that's the end of this video. Thanks for watching. Final message, so that was a short video to fill a bit of the void for the period. The idea popped in my head and I thought it'd be interesting to talk about. I'm still working on stuff, but I'll be doing a stream and guide for next Valpurgis. It doesn't seem like there's that much planned for the season, but I'll probably do a guide for the updated Railway 1 when it comes out at least. As usual, I'm giving news in the community tab on Mondays and subscribe to be notified and all. In any case, see you next time, and keep your sanity high in this slow descent into the inferno.